Hey guys, tonight we step quietly into a place where time drips like honey through the fingers of summer. Imagine walking barefoot along corridors of carved wood, beneath a sky the color of tea-stained silk, where every breeze carries the memory of orchids and the hush of distant water. There's no rush here. Nothing ever moves too quickly. You've arrived in the imperial summer realm, where a quiet king, wrapped in woven gold and stillness, wanders slowly through a world made of heat and shadow. Tonight, we will lie among silk curtains and breathe with the rhythm of a palace that only speaks in whispers. So settle in, let go of your thoughts, and let the warmth of this timeless world drift gently over you, like sunlight falling through old bamboo. The summer realm was not marked on any map. It didn't need to be. Its location was not measured in leagues or distance, but in breath, in slowness, in a particular golden hue that only appeared when the sun stood still in the sky. This realm belonged to a king who ruled not just by decree, but by the quietness of his rituals, the softness of his movements, and the exact shade of stillness that settled over the eaves of his palace at noon. The roof tiles, glazed in celadon and pearl, shimmered under the weight of the heat, absorbing light and silence in equal measure. The walls, carved from age-darkened wood, held echoes that no longer tried to escape. And inside, shaded from the sun's steady gaze, moved the emperor. Not hurried, not hunted, just there ever so softly existing. He wore layers of gauze-thin silk dyed in moon-washed gold. Each step he took was a whisper. His presence was never announced by trumpets or voices, only by the faint rustle of trailing fabric and the scent of amber oil. Servants stepped aside like shadows parting for wind. Even the wind seemed to bow, sliding past the pillars with reverence. Outside the palace halls, summer bloomed thick and sweet. Jasmine vines curled around stone balustrades. Peacocks rested in the shade of fig trees, their tails spread like forgotten fans. Fountains gurgled lazily, their water never rising too high, as if aware that even movement had a weight here. The emperor's realm was vast, but he moved through it like a dream through sleep. His favorite pavilion sat at the edge of a long shaded corridor that opened onto a lake of still water. From there, he could see everything and yet want for nothing. In this place, satisfaction was not found in taking, but in watching, listening, breathing in the sweet musk of ripened heat, and remembering that power, too, could be soft. The palace was alive in a way no city could understand. Its rhythm was that of cicadas and shifting light, of footfalls against old stone, of robes brushing over lacquered wood. The emperor did not speak much. He did not need to. The realm answered every unspoken question. It gave him everything he required: rest, beauty, and the delicate architecture of desire. It was said that he could spend hours in one room, watching a shadow move slowly across the floor, not because he lacked things to do, but because he knew that in that single moment lived the entire kingdom. He drank his tea slowly. He read old poems, even older than his ancestors, tracing the brushstrokes with fingers that had never held a sword. His strength came from knowing how to be still. The mornings began with silence. Always. Before the first cup of tea, before the morning incense, there was a long moment where the palace simply breathed. Curtains drifted in warm wind. Birds spoke in low, melodious tones. And in that space, the emperor stirred, not from duty, but from choice. He woke slowly, as if remembering himself each day. His chambers opened onto a small enclosed garden, where white lotuses floated in a pond clear as jade. Sometimes he would sit beside it for hours, watching the petals close and open again, tracking time by flowers instead of clocks. The garden obeyed no schedule but the sun's, just like him. Every season painted the palace in different shades, but summer was its most intimate version. In the heat, the walls softened, the colors deepened, and so too did the emperor's rituals. No part of his day was wasted. Every detail, every movement, was part of a larger rhythm. From the way his hair was combed, to the oil used on his temples, to the silk draped over his shoulder just so. Each gesture was the embodiment of a reign without rush. There was no court here in the summer realm. No loud petitions, no courtiers with sharp tongues. Just silence, scent, and ritual. Those who served the emperor did so with the quiet precision of monks. Their movements were practiced and pure. They did not speak unless spoken to, but they knew each one that they were part of something sacred, something slower than time. And the emperor himself? He was never truly alone, and yet always solitary. The palace moved around him like water around stone. The only sound that ever truly followed him was the gentle click of his wooden sandals on marble, and the distant, soft laughter of women far down the hall. These halls were not built for haste. They stretched long and high, cooled by shadows and the scent of sandalwood. The ceilings were painted with soft cloud dragons and cranes in flight. As the emperor walked beneath them, he often tilted his head slightly, watching as if expecting one of the painted wings to move. He carried no scrolls, no sword, no seal. The only thing he brought from room to room was his stillness. And in that stillness, an entire kingdom rested. The sun, unhurried, drifted across the tiles. Servants moved through shade like mist. The emperor paused in a doorway, watching the light settle on the steps. For a long moment he said nothing, did nothing, just breathed. And in that breath, summer deepened. This was the realm he had built not with conquest, but with waiting. Not with fire, but with warmth. Here, in the gentle hush of woven shadows, the emperor reigned not through fear or law, but through stillness and the slow unfolding of golden time. Inside a chamber where the walls were lined with mother of pearl and the air smelled faintly of star anise, a small curved cabinet stood alone. Its doors were carved with dragons in mid-flight quiet guardians of what lay within. This was the emperor's private store. No one entered unless summoned, and within it sat a single slender vessel of jade, the bottle that held his drink of endless fire. The liquid inside was not just a tonic, but a legacy. A slow, careful distillation of red ginseng root, deer velvet, and crushed seed of the lotus, each gathered at precise lunar moments. The bottle was kept sealed with beeswax, and silk thread dyed in vermilion. When opened, only a drop or two would be poured at a time into a small bowl of obsidian, never rushed, never wasted. The emperor did not drink this elixir for pleasure, but for presence. Its warmth spread like memory beginning in the chest, blooming outwards in slow spirals that reached the fingertips and earlobes. He would sit quietly after sipping, eyes half-lidded, breathing through his nose. Sometimes he would close his eyes altogether, and the servants would not disturb him for hours. It was said that this elixir came from a mountain no longer marked by name, its ingredients guarded by generations of apothecaries who spoke little and listened often. The heat of it was not a burn but a thrum, like the soft beat of a drum under layers of velvet. It awakened not frenzy, but clarity. The emperor called it the fire that walks slowly. He never drank it during court, only when alone, often in the cool hours before noon, when the light filtered through silk blinds and the only sound was the soft clinking of porcelain. The drink had no scent, yet those who entered the room after him swore they could feel it, like a trace of sun left behind on bare skin after stepping into shade. Each batch was prepared over many days, the roots first soaked in glacial spring water, then steamed, dried, and pressed into golden powder. A rare honey from hillside blossoms was added drop by drop, then strained through fine muslin woven from lotus fiber. The final mixture was kept still for 33 nights under a canopy of copper stars before it was ready to enter the bottle. Only one bottle was prepared each season. Only the emperor drank from it, and only in the moments when he wished not to be powerful, but simply aware. When he drank, his hands would grow warmer first, his spine would lengthen, His eyes would sharpen not with ambition, but with seeing. He would touch his chest lightly, as if confirming the beat of something ancient and slow inside him. He would then rise, walking without sound, through corridors filled with sunlight, his mind neither here nor there, but balanced precisely between the two. Servants spoke of his skin glowing faintly in those hours, as if the sun had decided to live within him. When he passed by, flowers seemed to straighten in their vases. Birds fell quiet. Even the wind paused to listen. The elixir was never stored with other drinks. It had its own chamber, lined with jade tiles and cooled by a single trickle of mountain water running through a carved channel in the floor. The emperor called this room the hollow furnace. He said it was where heat lived without flame. He never spoke while drinking it. There was no toast, no phrase, just the silent exchange between breath and substance. And after, when the warmth had reached every part of him, he would often sit beside the window of the West Pavilion and gaze out at the distant hills, where the outlines of the trees seemed drawn with charcoal. In these moments, his desires were not sharp or loud. They floated like incense smoke, merely tethered. And those around him knew this was not the emperor of decrees or battles. This was the emperor of fire without burn, of strength without weight, of a legacy carried in veins rather than stone. One afternoon, a court musician passed by the chamber and heard no sound, yet felt her skin prickle as if touched by heat. She turned her face away, whispering later that she had stood too close to something not meant for eyes, only for silence. Those closest to him said the emperor could feel the flow of this fire long after drinking. It lingered in him, pulsing through his limbs like the rhythm of unseen tides. It did not command. It waited. It reminded him of the slow, certain ways of nature. And it was in this reminder that he found his greatest calm. He once wrote in a hidden journal, "The fire must not chase. It must wait, and in waiting, it becomes the sun." These words were carved quietly into the frame of the bottle's cabinet, in script so fine it could only be seen at dusk when the light struck just right. The servants tasked with its preparation were trained from childhood. They wore no scent. They spoke to no one. Their hands never trembled, not even in winter. They believed the elixir was not a drink, but a living thing, a presence. And to prepare it was to enter into communion with the emperor himself. The jade bottle, though small, felt heavy in the hand, as if it carried not liquid, but memory. When poured, the elixir moved slowly, thicker than wine, but not syrup. And its color? A deep amber red, like the heart of a coal just before it fades to ash. There was no ceremony for the drink, yet each sip felt sacred. In a palace where everything was slow and deliberate, this single ritual carried a weight far greater than crowns or armor. It was the emperor's stillness, distilled, his desire not for conquest, but for balance. And so, each day that he drank, the sun outside felt warmer, the silk curtains moved more gently, and in the chambers beyond, the women of the court whispered less, smiled more, and waited, knowing that when the emperor passed again, he would not burn them with passion. He would warm them with fire that remembered to breathe. Beyond the emperor's chambers stretched a labyrinth wrapped in silence. The inner palace, known only to a handful of men and thousands of women, stood behind doors carved with phoenix wings and lotus vines. Here, soft light passed through paper screens, and the scent of peony lingered like breath on the skin of still water. 3,000 maidens lived within these walls, though none raised their voices above a whisper. Their footfalls were trained to vanish, absorbed by woven carpets the color of early fog. Some were barely more than girls, newly chosen from distant provinces, still learning the art of existing without ripple. Others had grown into their silk slippers, years folding into years, knowing precisely when to bow and when to blend. Each woman bore a different name, but few were ever spoken. Instead, Their presence was marked by movement, the tilt of a fan, the fold of a robe, the scent they carried as they passed through the morning air. Sandalwood, jasmine, or sometimes just the faint trace of steamed rice and night air. In this palace of silks, time moved like water beneath ice. The sun filtered through latticework, scattering golden squares onto tiled walkways where koi fish swam quietly beneath. The world here was slow, deliberate. Even the birds that nested along the eaves sang in minor tones, as if afraid to wake something sleeping. The corridors twisted softly, never ending in straight lines. Each corner held a different shade of stillness, pools of warm light where women sat weaving silver thread into gowns no one would wear for years, or alcoves lined with scrolls where older attendants read poetry in low, rhythmic hums. The silks these women wore were dyed with colors borrowed from the natural world, pale green, like the inside of a plum, blue like early evening, the palest rose of morning clouds. They drifted when they moved, like petals caught in slow wind, and made no sound. Every window opened inward, each balcony guarded by fretwork, designed not to keep them in, but to keep the outside world from slipping too far inside. The emperor had designed it this way, not for control, but to preserve the softness, to protect the slow dream in which the palace lived. No one hurried here. Even the bells that rang the morning hour did so with velvet hammers, letting each note fade gently into the corridors. When meals were served, they came in bowls of lacquered wood, covered to hold warmth. Each woman ate quietly, sitting in loose clusters beneath painted screens of cranes and water lily. They did not speak of love. Love was not a word they needed. They lived in a world of glances, brushes of cloth, and the memory of a breath on the neck that might have been the emperor's or just the wind through an open screen. Most days passed in silent preparation. There were gardens to tend, hair to comb, silk to mend. There were books to copy, floors to sweep with soft straw brooms, bodies to bathe in warm milk and rosewater. And through it all, the sense that something was always just about to begin, but never quite did. The youngest of them still dreamed of being chosen, of the emperor's eyes resting on them one afternoon and never turning away. But those who had lived longer within the carved walls understood that being seen was not always the same as being remembered. There were hidden courtyards within the maze, tiny, private spaces with moon bridges and stone lanterns, where moss grew thick and undisturbed. In one such courtyard stood a single tree, a white magnolia, ancient and low. It bloomed only once a year, but its petals held a fragrance that lingered for days. The women would sit nearby, never speaking, breathing in that one brief season of sweetness as if storing it in their bones. At night, the halls darkened slowly, as if reluctant to let go of the light. Lamps were lit by hand, one by one, casting a dim gold over the silk-covered walls. The women moved more slowly then, their steps more measured, as though slipping gently into dreams without needing sleep. In some chambers, the women painted, not for anyone else, not to display, just slow, fluid brushwork on pale rice paper. Blossoms, mountains, sometimes the outline of a figure they had seen only once, years ago, and still remembered. Each woman had a mirror, but many chose not to look. Not out of modesty, but because they already knew the contours of their own faces, the shadows under their eyes, the curve of their cheek when they smiled. Instead, they used the mirrors to reflect candlelight onto the ceiling, making stars out of flame. Some women played the chin fingers, moving slowly across its strings, coaxing out long, mournful tones that seemed to pause in midair before fading. The music was never performed. It simply existed, like a sigh stretched into sound, curling through the chambers like smoke. They had no calendars here, only the feel of seasons shifting, the way tea tasted different when winter approached, how the wind smelled of pine in early spring, or the silk robes grew heavier in summer. Their lives were marked not by events, but by sensations. In this palace, silence was not emptiness. It was texture. It was presence. It filled the air like fragrance, softening everything it touched. Even sorrow, even longing, was made gentle by it. And within this tapestry of hush and grace, the emperor moved like an unspoken thought. Rarely seen, his presence lingered only in the delicate scent of his silk robes, drifting gently through corridors long after his steps had vanished. The silk stirred, as if memory itself had brushed past. 3,000 women, each with her own dream, waited in quiet stillness, not hoping for change, but preserving what already was. Their lives, like the palace, became timeless. Wrapped in silence, they did not sleep so much as drift, suspended between breath and dream. Over time, they became part of the walls, the air, the hush. Not forgotten, not remembered, simply existing in a rhythm too soft for the world beyond. They were the breath between moments, the pause in the emperor's name, the silk that never wrinkled. The rose garden lay just beyond the eastern pavilion, where the palace walls loosened their grip and allowed the sunlight to wander freely. It was here that the emperor often walked, after the morning's incense had faded and the scrolls had been set aside. The stone path beneath his feet had been worn smooth by generations of emperors before him, though none had walked with quite his sense of stillness. On either side, bushes of old garden roses bent low, their petals soft as whispers, brushing against the silk hem of his robe. Some had bloomed fully, pink and ivory and wild with scent. Others clung to their buds, closed and secretive, as though waiting for a quieter hour to open. Clusters of ripe persimmons hung from thick branches in the orchard that shared the garden's outer edge. The trees leaned slightly, as if heavy with their own dreams. The fruits glowed with that particular shade of orange, found only in memories of summer warm, full, forgiving. Occasionally, a ripe one would fall, landing with a muted sound in the moss. The emperor never picked them. He only passed by, letting their presence remind him of sweetness that asked for nothing in return. A soft breeze stirred the garden, lifting the scent of roses and the faint green sharpness of persimmon leaves. The air was thick with pollen and peace. Somewhere, a cicada sang a slow, measured rhythm, like a distant heartbeat beneath the earth. The emperor paused at a curve in the path, where two stones marked a fork. One led deeper into the trees, the other back toward the courtyard of quiet waters. Today, as on most days, he chose neither immediately. Instead, he lingered where the garden held its breath, where time folded into itself like the petal of a rose just before it opened. The sky above was pale and cloudless, yet held the gentle weight of afternoon. Sunlight draped over the leaves in long ribbons, golden and loose. Each ray fell with such slowness that it seemed to carry a story, one meant only for those who didn't rush to hear it. And beneath that light, the emperor moved not as a ruler, but as one invited by the garden, welcomed not by ceremony, but by the rustle of leaves and the curve of a flower bending toward his shadow. Every step he took was cushioned by the moss-laced path. Somewhere to the side, a small stone lantern tilted forward slightly, like it too had grown drowsy in the sun. Tiny birds hopped along the branches, their movements brisk and soft, like punctuation marks in the stillness. None of them feared him. There was no reason to. In this garden, nothing demanded, and nothing was denied. A servant once suggested pruning back the rose bushes to keep the paths clear, but the emperor refused. He preferred the way they spilled over their borders, reaching freely, as though the garden itself had forgotten its constraints. He often thought the roses looked best just before they fell apart, when their petals were softening, their colors fading, their shapes surrendering to the breeze. In that moment, they were both present and disappearing, like a breath released into the summer air. Nearby, a shallow basin of water mirrored the sky. The reflection of persimmon branches trembled on its surface, only to settle again. Occasionally, a leaf would land silently, sending slow ripples outward. These were not ripples that disturbed, but ripples that seemed to remind the basin it was alive. The emperor sat beside it for a time, knees folded beneath him, his fingers loosely resting in his lap. He did not close his eyes. Instead, he watched the water, and the garden watched him. In a quieter corner, where the roses gave way to ferns and stone, an old bench rested beneath the limbs of a pomegranate tree. The fruit had not yet ripened, but their forms had begun to show through the dense leaves. The emperor often stopped there, letting his mind drift into the slow alchemy of growing things. His thoughts became petals, seeds, rain. They no longer belonged to the matters of state, to records or seals or generals. Here they floated, weightless as the thin red dragonflies weaving through the air. Occasionally, a servant would appear at the edge of the garden, respectfully silent. If the emperor noticed, he gave no sign. There was no urgency here, no expectation. Even the breeze seemed to move at his pace, winding around him like silk unfurled in slow motion. At times, he would rise and continue his walk. At others, he would remain seated until the light turned lavender and the cicadas quieted. In the rose garden, no voice ever broke the stillness. And yet, the silence breathed with quiet sounds, not of speech, but of presence. Leaves brushed gently against one another in the breeze. Their movements, like soft agreements, whispered between old friends. Ripe fruit, heavy with sun, released itself to the moss below with the faintest of sighs. Light spilled slowly over the garden, not striking or commanding, but pouring like warm tea over stone, over root, over bloom delicate and deliberate. The emperor, though the master of a vast and intricate realm, did not command this garden. Here he let go. He walked not as a ruler, but as a guest, his power set aside like a robe at the threshold. In this quiet sanctuary of petals and scent, he surrendered not in weakness, but in reverence. And in doing so, he found a realm untouched by maps or scrolls, a kingdom without walls, a peace that required no name. As the morning light lengthened and curved gently toward the center of day, the scent of persimmons ripening in the warm air began to deepen thick, honeyed, earthy. The garden responded, folding itself around the emperor like an old memory remembered only in dreams. It asked nothing. It offered everything. Each step he took was slower than the last, not out of weariness, but because the moment asked to be noticed, to be lived fully. There was nothing to recall, no past tugging at his thoughts. There was no need to anticipate, no future calling his name. There was only this, the hush of leaves, the warmth of sunlit fruit, and the next quiet breath drawn in among roses. The pavilion stood at the edge of the inner court, tucked behind low, flowering hedges and shaded by the broad leaves of ancient camphor trees. It was not grand in size, but in stillness. Its pillars were lacquered in a shade of dusky red that had faded with centuries, and its roof curved gently like the back of a sleeping cat. It did not declare its presence, but invited the eye, like a whisper carried on slow wind. The breeze here always seemed cooler, gentler. During the height of summer, when the air in the rest of the palace hung heavy and unmoving, this little pavilion gathered currents of air that slipped between gauze, curtains, and under silk mats, kissing bare skin with a chill both welcome and strange. Within this space, time softened. The pace of the day unraveled, and everything that entered became hushed. At its center stood a bed, low and wide, covered in layer upon layer of embroidered silk, dyed in shades of pearl, ink, and moonstone. The fabrics shimmered faintly, like water under candlelight, and carried the faint perfume of lotus root and amber. The bed was never disturbed, yet it always bore the impression of rest, a soft depression at its center, as though time itself had once curled there and fallen asleep. Beneath the pavilion's slanted roof, soft lanterns hung from carved wooden hooks. Their light, filtered through pale cloth, cast shadows that danced and drifted like slow-moving clouds. Each movement of the curtains brought a new pattern to the floor, a shifting mosaic of light and air. On occasion, petals would fall from the high trees beyond the hedges, floating through the open latticework and landing silently on the silken covers, where they were left undisturbed until they disappeared on their own. The emperor often came here alone after long mornings of quiet observation. He did not bring attendants or scholars, nor did he call for music or company. He brought only himself, his breath, and his unspoken weight. He would sit upon the wide divan by the bed, resting his hand upon the cool silk, feeling the weave with his fingertips, until the rhythm of touch soothed the hum of thought into stillness. There were hours when he lay upon the bed, not to sleep, but to vanish. His eyes would half close, not shut, watching the flicker of curtain and lantern with a gaze detached from time. He was not king there. He was breath and warmth and skin, indistinguishable from the cushions beneath him. The air carried no urgency. Even the occasional chirp of a cicada or rustle of leaves felt muted, as though the sounds bowed to the hush of the pavilion. Tea was sometimes brought, left at the threshold by silent hands. A small porcelain cup, steam curling gently from within, placed just beyond the silk edge of the mat. The emperor would reach for it only after many minutes, sipping the lukewarm liquid with slow precision, tasting more the moment than the tea itself. The ceiling above him was painted in fading blue, where delicate scenes of clouds and birds curled in and out of soft golden frames. Though the paint had chipped with time, its presence calmed the eye. Some believed the pavilion had once belonged to a consort from a dynasty past, but the emperor had never spoken of its origin. Perhaps he preferred it that way, untethered to history, free from story. Sometimes, before the heat of the day had fully settled, he would slip off his shoes and let his feet rest upon the cool tiled floor. The stone, worn smooth by age and care, sent a gentle thrill up his legs, grounding him. He would sit that way for long stretches, body still, mind floating, tracing the rise and fall of his breath as if it were a silk ribbon in slow wind. The pavilion held memory, but not in the way of palaces. It did not remember names or dates. It remembered mood, temperature, scent, the exact shade of light on a summer afternoon. It remembered the sigh of skin meeting silk, the soft weight of rest without sleep, the breath that did not need to be drawn deeply to be real. Here, the emperor was not surrounded by his lineage, nor by the echo of judgment or responsibility. He was, in the most tender sense, simply present. Wrapped in soft air, cradled by shadows and scent, he let himself drift to the edge of thought. The pavilion did not expect. It only received. Sometimes the gauze curtain would stir with the lightest breeze, lifting just enough to reveal a sliver of sky-faint blue, brushed with the softest traces of rose and gold. In those delicate moments, time seemed to slow beyond motion, beyond memory. Thought became heavier than silence, and silence became lighter than breath. If the emperor closed his eyes then, it was not from weariness, nor from intention. It was simply to dissolve gently, completely into the stillness that held everything together. No chronicle spoke of these hours. No ink captured the way the light gathered on the polished floor, or how the breeze carried the scent of distant blossoms through silk-draped corridors. There were no scribes for this kind of presence. Only the silks remembered, and they did so without sound. Only the curved wood of the resting bench, smoothed by years of quiet leaning, held the shape of him. Only the air, which cooled differently after his shadow passed, knew how to carry the story forward. He came without sound, and he left the same way, rising slowly, his footsteps soft, his presence slipping from the space like steam from a teacup. And yet the pavilion never remained quite the same. Though unchanged to the eye, it always felt slightly more full, as though it had taken a breath in his presence and was holding it with quiet reverence. Nothing in the room had shifted, yet everything had deepened. It was a space that remembered without needing to speak. A space that waited not for action, but for stillness. And when he returned, it would welcome him not with fanfare, but with the exact hush he had left behind, carried carefully in folds of silk and light. In the thickest hush of early afternoon, when the sun stretched long arms of heat across glazed tiles and the cicadas whispered drowsily beyond the walls, the ritual of the summer noons began. Each day, as steady as the breath of the palace itself, 5 maidens would walk barefoot across the cool stone of the corridor, their silk robes rustling like a breeze caught in folded paper. Their presence was quiet, but not without purpose. They entered not as individuals, but as a single drifting offering, one of scent, softness, and care. Each maiden brought with her something intangible, yet unmistakable. One carried the scent of jasmine oil on her skin, so faint it seemed imagined. Another moved as if her limbs remembered music that had never been written. A third wore her hair, tied in a ribbon the color of apricot, and her fingers left cool traces where they passed. The last 2 moved more slowly, more carefully, their steps gently curved by the new life they carried, unseen but deeply known. They did not speak. They did not need to. Inside the pavilion, the air had already been cooled by the steady movement of wide fans carved from pale pearl. Bowls of water infused with chrysanthemum and slices of cucumber stood on low trays, collecting the quiet of the room. A soft fragrance of lotus petals lingered in the fabric of the cushions, and the emperor's presence was a still point in the center of it all. Reclining, not in command, but in ease, he waited not for service, but for stillness. And the maidens answered with gestures, with rhythm, with a reverence that had no name. One began with a warm cloth, pressed gently to his wrists, his temples, the back of his neck. The heat of the morning lifted from his skin like mist, leaving behind only the sensation of release. Another smoothed sandalwood oil across his chest, each motion deliberate and light, as if writing symbols in a language only the body could read. The pregnant ones did not kneel or serve. Instead, they simply sat nearby, hands on their bellies, humming softly without sound, their closeness a kind of blessing the room inhaled. No words passed. Words were unnecessary intrusions in this space. What passed between them was far older than speech. The scent of summer skin, the warmth of human nearness, the knowledge that time itself could stretch and soften if only invited to do so. The emperor closed his eyes, not in weariness, but in gratitude. The room did not vanish. It deepened. Now and then, one maiden would gently fan him with a length of embroidered silk, the movement slow and careful, more ceremony than comfort. Another offered a porcelain cup of mulberry tea, its sweetness dark and cooling. Even the act of sipping was unhurried, drawn out like a note, held just past its expected end. Outside, the summer sun pressed its golden weight against the palace walls, warm and steady like a hand resting on a sleeping shoulder. The air shimmered just beyond the carved latticework, thick with light, but unable to breach the hush within. Inside the pavilion, where silk veils shifted like water, time slowed to a breath, and then to something quieter still, a presence without sound, a moment without measure. Among the 5 maidens who attended the emperor each summer noon, 2 moved with a grace softened by new life. Their bodies, gently rounded, carried the hush of expectation like a hidden pulse. They did not seek notice, did not adjust their gait for admiration. Yet the emperor's gaze would sometimes find them, steady and quiet, resting upon them like sunlight caught in the folds of silk. He did not summon them, did not speak. He simply witnessed them, and in that quiet attention there was a reverence beyond ceremony. One of the 2 would, at times, pause during the slow arc of a turn, her hand moving instinctively to rest at the small of her back. Not to dramatize, not to gesture, but to acknowledge within herself that something ancient stirred beneath her skin. The emperor, reclining in stillness never interrupted. His eyelids half lowered, he watched with a gaze softened by knowing, yet untouched by expectation. In this rhythm of heat and hush, every gesture carried the weight of meaning. A hand brushing against a robe, the sound of silk meeting stone, a faint stir of air when a bird's song stilled beyond the lattice. Eventually, as the hour turned, each maiden would leave as gently as she had come. They did not speak, did not bow. Their exit was simply the slow undoing of presence. Fingers lingering just long enough on the edge of a fan, the fold of a sleeve, the curve of lacquered wood. The two who carried his unborn children remained behind the others, moving in tandem, side by side, their silhouettes curved like matching brushstrokes drawn by an unseen artist. Their departure left behind no sound, yet the room remembered them. The very air seemed to breathe more slowly after they were gone, reluctant to let go. The emperor did not rise. He remained, eyes closed, body suspended in the calm they had created. The scent of sandalwood and jasmine still clung faintly to his skin, a memory of touch without tension. The room, though now empty of bodies, felt more occupied than before, filled with the softness of what had passed through, and the certainty that it would come again. He stayed in that space, not out of idleness, but because there was nothing more urgent than presence, nothing more powerful than rest. This stillness was not a pause between duties. It was itself a form of rule, a deep tether anchoring him to the realm he guided. Outside, the day reached its full bloom. The sunlight, rich and golden, wrapped itself around roof tiles and slipped between the slats of bamboo screens, only to dissolve at the threshold. And inside, wrapped in silence and silk, the emperor remained. Not as a symbol, not as a sovereign, but simply as a man in peace. Here, in the heart of the summer noon, where stillness reigned without decree, the empire turned quietly on the breath of its ruler. And the hush held him not to restrain, but to cradle, to remind him that within stillness there is continuity, and in continuity there is power. The hours after noon unfolded slowly, as if the day itself had chosen to recline. Within the secluded chamber cooled by layers of carved pearl and silk, everything softened light, thought, breath. The world beyond the palace walls pressed on, but here time was filtered through shadows, slowed like water moving through silk. It was not merely afternoon, it was a pause in existence, a hush between pulses. Overhead, large fans spun in graceful rhythm. Their frames, made of mother-of-pearl inlaid with silver veins, shimmered as they moved. Each rotation cast faint glimmers across the walls, soft and flickering like candlelight beneath water. These fans did not hum or whir. They whispered. Their movement disturbed nothing, only encouraging the air to drift like sleep across skin and silk. One could watch them for hours and feel no change, yet emerge as if from a gentle dream. Below them, the emperor reclined upon a platform raised only slightly from the floor, the woven mats beneath layered with gossamer-thin cushions. A robe of pale jade silk lay across his form, untouched by weight. His arms rested at his sides, fingertips loose, his chest rising and falling in a rhythm slower than rest. He was not asleep, but he was no longer tethered entirely to thought. Through the silk screens, the afternoon light filtered with a rose-gold hue, casting delicate patterns that shifted with the sun. Sometimes, those watching from the shadows could see the shape of a dragon coiled in the folds of light and fabric, a coincidence, perhaps, or a reflection of something deeper within the room. The air inside carried the faintest blend of jasmine and cooled sandalwood, a scent balanced so precisely it might disappear if one tried to focus on it. It wasn't meant to be noticed. It was meant to envelop like memory, like breath. Beyond the curtain, distant water trickled from a small fountain made from pale stone, its sound a metronome to the moment. Somewhere outside, a dove called once, then fell silent, as if the hush of the chamber had reached even that far. Attendants moved rarely here, and only when the emperor gestured, which was infrequent. Their steps were slower than quiet, more like presence passing through light. Their hands adjusted pillows, refolded the end of a robe, refreshed a dish of cooled plum slices, never more than needed, and never less. They did not speak. They were trained to interpret the rhythms of his breath, the direction of his glance, the soft motion of a single finger. In this stillness, even small shifts became poetry. A way the silk of the emperor's robe slid slightly across his chest as he inhaled. The way the carved shadows of the fan traced a different line down his forearm every few minutes. Each movement was not just observed, but absorbed, like light settling into still water. The fan blades continued their silent dance above. The emperor's gaze, half-lidded, watched them briefly before falling once more into a drifting focus. He was not thinking. He was not meditating. He was simply being complete and unhurried, as though his body understood something his mind had forgotten long ago. At the edge of the room, a young maiden sat cross-legged beside an ornate screen, holding a bowl of cool water in which floated a single lotus petal. She was not meant to offer it unless asked. But her presence, like everything else here, was part of the slow ritual of presence, where nothing rushed forward and nothing withdrew. She waited with the patience of water in a still pond. The emperor shifted slightly, and the silks around him answered with a sigh. He did not reach for anything. There was nothing to grasp. In this hour, desire itself became something distant, not absent, but transformed. No longer a flame, but a warmth. No longer a pursuit, but a presence. And so, time passed. Not by seconds or minutes, but by changes in light, in breath, in the position of a shadow upon the floor. Outside, the sun turned ever so slightly. Inside, the fans carved of pearl continued their ceaseless motion. The emperor remained. Eventually, a servant entered not through a door, but through a shifting panel behind the screen. She carried a folded cloth scented with lotus root and camphor, meant to soothe the skin from the heat of midday. She paused at the threshold, waiting until the emperor's eyes acknowledged her. Then, with measured grace, she stepped forward and placed the cloth upon a tray nearby without looking up. Her presence was like a breeze that crossed the room and then vanished. She withdrew the way she had come, and silence resumed its gentle reign. The emperor lifted the cloth with deliberate care, pressing it lightly to the side of his neck. The sensation was brief, cooling, and he let the moment expand around it, as if that touch alone deserved its own measure of time. The room, the breath, the slow-turning fans all existed now in a single rhythm, quiet and seamless, like silk drawn through still water. This was not a space for sleep, yet it offered something even deeper, a descent into stillness, into the soft dissolution of thought. Here, nothing was required. No effort to speak, no desire to act. Just the body, the light, and the quiet pulse of presence. Peace in this place did not arrive as an escape, but as a gentle design. It had been built deliberately, each fold of fabric, each polished surface, each breeze coaxed into movement, not by chance, but by care. It was too soft to shatter, too slow to disturb. Nothing broke here, nothing strained. Even time seemed to rest its wings. The emperor, in all his command, had become merely a presence, no less powerful, but no longer distinct from the room around him. He did not need to decide or remember. He did not reach forward. He simply allowed. And beyond the sill-covered walls, the vastness of the world waited. But it could not enter. Only this chamber remained, untouched and complete, a place that seemed it had always existed and always would, turning gently, quietly, beneath fans carved of pearl. The door to the chamber opened without a sound. No hand was seen. No hinge groaned. It was as if the breath of the building itself had parted the way, revealing a room bathed in a delicate hue, not pink, not gold, but something between the two, like the color of first light through rose-petal glass. This was not a place meant to impress, but to hold. Its walls seemed to hum faintly with warmth, their curved surfaces wrapped in soft silks, their edges blurred by the gentle scatter of light. There were no sharp corners here. Everything curved, everything invited. Cushions overflowed like flower petals fallen into heaps. Drapes moved only slightly, yet suggested the memory of wind. This was the emperor's inner sanctum for repose after the noon hour, a place neither night nor day fully claimed, a space without names where time did not dare intrude. He stepped inside alone. No one was summoned. No one needed to be. The air already bore the trace of those who had been there, fragrance still lingering from the oils pressed gently onto his skin earlier. The faint warmth of cushions that had cradled him, and the deeper impression of shared stillness that words would have ruined. There were always blossoms here, but never arranged. They arrived through unseen hands, fresh, soft, and imperfectly perfect. A few lay scattered on the floor, as if they had wandered out of their vases and decided to rest where they pleased. Among them, the blush of peony, the subtle sheen of camellia, and always a single sprig of plum, quiet and reaching. As he lay back, the folds of silk cradled him with a familiarity earned over endless days just like this one. His body did not sink, it settled, slowly, naturally, like mist returning to the valley. Above him, a lantern swung slightly, not from breeze, but memory. The light inside pulsed like a heartbeat, diffused through layers of dyed parchment. Not bright enough to read by, yet full of warmth. It cast shadows that did not fall in straight lines, but wandered as if they too were resting. There were places where silence feels hollow. This was not one of them. Here silence was full. It was thick with presence. It held the murmur of silk shifting, the sound of a robe brushed by a hand not raised. It held the weight of expectation, but not the demanding kind. The kind that waits with patience, with love. The kind that believes nothing need be rushed. Sometimes, on certain days, the two women bearing his children would pause at the threshold, just long enough to feel the temperature of the room, to note the stillness as a sign that nothing need be done. Then they would slip away, as quiet as they came. Other times they entered, not as attendants, not as symbols, but simply as breath beside breath. In those moments, no gestures were made, no words exchanged. They sat on cushions, at a distance respectful but not cold, their hands resting on their curved bellies, their eyes cast downward not from shyness, but from softness. The emperor did not speak. He only listened to the rhythm of their breathing, to the hush in the corners, to the sound of possibility swelling just beneath their skin. There was a kind of communication there that spoke without voice. When one shifted her position, the other mirrored. When one breathed more deeply, the other matched her cadence. The emperor, lying there in the center of all this blooming quiet, absorbed them without taking. He did not possess. He welcomed. Every so often, one of the women would lean slightly forward, her hands cradling the base of her stomach, eyes closed. A small motion, a private moment shared without direction. The emperor would not move, but his gaze would soften. And in that gaze, there was no lust, only lineage, only reverence for the mystery of continuity. Outside, the day slid slowly toward its latter half. Shadows stretched, but not quickly. The light in the chamber shifted with a patience known only to places that had waited for centuries. It moved across fabric, skin, lacquer, hair. It moved without command, and so was never wrong. One of the women began to hum. It was not a tune, but a melody. Just a single low tone, steady and soft, so gentle it barely touched the air. It did not disturb the silence. Instead, it deepened it, like water darkening beneath moonlight. The emperor felt himself soften into it. He was no longer a figure of rule, no longer the center of a vast court. In that moment, he was only a body at rest, wrapped in silk, warmed by breath, drifting into the space between sound and stillness. The hum faded, not abruptly, but as if it had simply become the silence itself. A presence that lingered, like a scent in the folds of a robe, or the echo of a glance held just a moment too long. It did not end, it dissolved. The women rose. They did not bow. They did not speak. Their movements were effortless, as though they had always known exactly when to leave. Feet silent against thick carpet, shadows merging with the folds of the curtain. Then the door closed, without sound, without finality. And the emperor remained, alone but not lonely, resting not as a ruler, but as a man emptied of weight, full only of quiet. In this room there were no duties, no scrolls, no names, just the unfolding of breath, the memory of presence, the feel of something sacred that had passed through and left its shape behind. The air thickened with warmth and rose-colored light, not fading, but deepening. A bloom not of petals, but of emotion, of quiet connection, of something untouched yet deeply felt. And in this hush, the room remembered. A chamber of blush and bloom, not marked on any map, not written in any record, but real, soft, enduring, whole. Somewhere in the western wing of the palace, where the air moved more slowly and the windows stayed closed to preserve the silence, there was a chamber known not by name, but by scent, a faint fragrance of ink, old paper, and cedar. The emperor entered it alone. The door closed with a whisper, and the hush inside was not of emptiness, but of attention. The shelves were carved from ancient wood, smoothed by hands that had not held swords but scrolls. Light filtered in through a round screen of silk, just enough to soften the gold of the floor and the dust in the air. It felt like entering another time, one that moved neither forward nor back. On these shelves rested the heartbeats of many centuries, wrapped in silk, tied in red thread. The red was not bright, but weathered like blood remembered, not bled. The threads wound around each scroll like a ritual, a promise that what lay inside had been touched by purpose. The emperor's hands hovered over the rows. He never rushed to choose. Each scroll had a weight beyond the physical, and some days his fingers knew which one they needed before his mind did. Today they paused on a slender scroll with a delicate crimson tie, no wider than his thumb. He lifted it slowly, like lifting breath from still water. He set it down before him on a low lacquered table and sat cross-legged, letting his robe pull around him in quiet folds. Then, with the care of a man unwrapping memory itself, he undid. And not the scroll unfurled like a sigh. The ink was dark and precise, as though the words had been breathed onto the paper, not written. They were not laws, not commands. These were teachings, fragments of thought, reflections on body and breath, energy and silence. It was not about control, but flow. Not dominance, but presence. The emperor read slowly. Each character became a breath, and each breath softened the line between what was outside of him and what was within. One passage spoke of the dantian, the energy center, low in the belly, and how to warm it with thought alone. Another described the movement of ki in spring, and how to guide it not with force, but with awareness. There was a drawing, too. A single black line curving around a figure, showing a path from base to crown, a channel not of blood, but of subtle knowing. He traced it with one finger, not to learn it, but to remember that he already knew. His body had always known. Outside, a breeze passed the window, barely stirring the silk screen. It brought with it the faintest scent of magnolia. The emperor paused, allowing the fragrance to drift into the room, then disappear. Like thought, like desire, like all things when given space. He turned the scroll to its final lines. Bare, In a more fragile hand were words that did not teach, but blessed. Where silence meets breath, there the spirit returns. Where stillness gathers, the self dissolves. To be whole is to be hollowed. The emperor closed his eyes for a moment, not in prayer, not in fatigue, but in absorption. There was nothing to do with these teachings but allow them. Let them rest inside him like warm stones at the bottom of a stream. When he opened his eyes, the room had not changed. The light remained soft, the scroll remained open, but something had settled deeper within him like tea leaves at the base of a cup. He rolled the scroll again, careful not to crease the fibers. The red thread he tied once more, not too tight. As tradition dictated, it should be easy for the next hand to open. Knowledge, after all, was never meant to be owned, only held briefly. Like rain in cupped palms, he rose slowly, letting his knees unfold with the weightless patience of a leaf. Falling through still air, the scroll returned to its place, not as an object of reverence, but as a companion, one of many, all waiting, all ready to be remembered again. Before leaving, he paused, not from hesitation, but completion. This moment, like the scroll, had unfolded and returned to its center. Nothing had changed, and everything had. He stepped out into the corridor, where silence wore a different shape. Here, it was touched by distant sounds, birds, footsteps far away, the faint movement of someone sweeping petals in a courtyard he could not see. But inside him, the silence he carried from the room remained intact. Back in his chambers, he would not speak of what he read. No one would ask. This was not knowledge to be discussed. It was the kind that shaped his breathing, his way of walking, his gaze. The kind that made him a ruler not by decree, but by presence. The kind that taught him to rule first over himself. Evening approached with quiet dignity, as if it too had learned the art of patience. Shadows lengthened gently along the lacquered floor, stretching like silk in slow motion. The emperor did not rush toward the dusk. He welcomed it the way one welcomes the breath after a deep pause. His meal was modest steamed rice, softened greens, a single cup of warm broth. He tasted each bite without need for more. Later, he stepped into the still pool of his private bath, the water barely rippling as he submerged himself. No perfume was added, only the faint scent of the surrounding stone warmed by the day. And when at last he lay down, wrapped in layers of quiet linen, he closed his eyes not in weariness, but in surrender. The shape of the scroll remained in him, its curve echoing in his spine, its meaning stitched silently through his breath. The red thread, once tied by his hands, now rested in his blood like a memory not needing to be remembered. The scroll, chamber, silent and unchanged, waited behind him, as it always had, as it always would. A room where red threads bound more than paper, where time bowed instead of marched, where nothing ever shouted and everything gently whispered. The rain began as it always did, quiet, soft, almost imagined. A single drop against the curved tile roof, then another, then more. Not a storm, but a hush and exhalation from the sky. The kind of rain that didn't rush to wet the earth, but chose instead to arrive with reverence, as if asking permission to fall. In the upper chambers of the eastern wing, the emperor stood barefoot at the edge of a stone corridor, his robe open at the collar, sleeves trailing like smoke. The air had changed. He had felt it before the first drop. A shift so subtle it existed only in the language of breath, the way the lungs received it, the way the skin spoke back. Below, the garden paths darkened slightly as the first rain touched them. Leaves curled to greet it. Blossoms closed gently. In response, no one spoke. Servants walked slower. Doors remained ajar a moment longer. Even the palace birds stilled beneath the eaves, letting the hush of water fill the space usually held by song. Inside, in a chamber dimmed by twilight and cloud, one of the emperor's favorite spaces waited, a room not for sleeping, nor for meeting, simply for being. Here, ink was prepared with care. No brush yet dipped, no words yet chosen. Just the scent of pine soot and water, ready. The emperor entered, and let his robe slip from his shoulders, revealing a canvas not of paper but of flesh. A woman knelt behind him, her palms cool and steady. She had no name that mattered in this moment. Only presence. Only skill. She did not speak as she dipped. The brush. The ink was warm, pulled slowly along the grain of her strokes. She began not with characters, but with lines sweeping, continuous, like rivers pulled from memory. The emperor exhaled and remained still. The rain outside found rhythm now, steady, comforting, a lullaby for wood and stone. The brush moved. Across his back, across his shoulder blades, down the spine in curves that mirrored branches, or perhaps the strokes of old poetry long forgotten by scholars, but kept alive by hands such as hers. These were not letters to be read. They were not poems to be spoken aloud. They were a conversation in shape and silence. Sometimes her strokes pressed deeper, darker. Other times they skimmed so lightly he wondered if she had touched him at all. But always there was meaning. Not in the ink, but in the attention. His. Breath slowed, sensed now with the tap of rain on the wooden sill. He did not need to understand the marks. He did not ask. There was no explanation, no lesson, no conclusion to draw. Only sensation. Only stillness. Only the memory of the brush moving across him like a tide, gentle and deliberate. The woman paused now and then, not to look at her work, but to listen. To the rain. To his breath. To the quiet music of time that did not need clocks. Outside, puddles began to form on the polished stone paths. In the garden, petals floated gently on rising pools of water. Inside, in the hush between rush strokes, the emperor imagined the ink sinking beneath his skin, becoming part of him like rain absorbed into soil, like memory absorbed into lineage. When the final mark was made, she set the brush aside, not with fanfare, not with ceremony. Just a simple motion, like placing a dream back into its drawer. She rose, stepped away. The emperor remained still, the ink drying in the cooling air. The rain's rhythm continued, steady as breath. The chamber held the scent of pine smoke and silk. The air was thick with peace, but light with release. Later, when he stood and moved toward the open door, he felt not heavier, but more complete. The ink did not weigh him down. It lifted him, as if carrying a story written not to be told, but to be held within. He looked once more at the room before leaving. The stone bowl, still half filled with black ink. The folded cloth beside it. The soft imprint of her knees in the woven mat. All remained exactly as they had been, simple, unchanged. Yet the space felt altered, fuller somehow. The woman had already gone. Like the rain, she did not demand attention. She arrived, she gave. She left her presence lingering not in sound or sight, but in the change she left behind. The emperor walked slowly through the quiet corridor. The rain continued, softening every edge, blurring every line. He felt the ink on his skin cool, tightening as it dried, and knew it would fade by morning. It always did. And yet it always remained. Some marks were not meant to last on the surface. They were meant to sink deeper, to change the way the skin remembered touch, to remind the body that it had once been still enough to receive meaning, to carry it without speaking. Back in his private quarters, the emperor wrapped himself in a robe of unbleached silk-light, unadorned, and warm from the dry air. The fabric touched the ink gently, as though acknowledging what had been written. There, not in language, but in intention. It did not smudge. It did not question. It simply embraced the faint dampness with quiet understanding. He did not speak. There was no need to. No servants approached. No orders were issued. The room accepted his presence, as it always had without expectation. Without fanfare he lowered himself onto a cushion beneath the slanted ceiling beams, and sat still for a long while, listening. Outside, the rain whispered along the tiled roofs, down carved eaves, across the moss-covered stones of the inner courtyard. It was not just weather. It was memory. It was time, slowed to the rhythm of water on earth. The palace breathed around. Him, the past held him gently. The ink on his back cooled as it dried, but the meaning warmed him from within. And in this moment, beneath a roof soaked in silence and remembrance, he desired nothing more. No scroll, no throne, no title. Only this stillness. Only the weightless script against his skin. Only the sound of rain on silk. The evening slipped in quietly, wearing robes of lavender and pearl. Its light arrived slowly, first gilding the edges of tiles, then softening the air between branches. It did not rush or call attention to itself. It simply appeared like a thought half remembered. The heat of the day began to loosen, unwinding from stone and skin, leaving behind the faintest trace of citrus and dust. In the emperor's chambers, a small table was set near the open window. Upon it, a single porcelain cup rested beside a lacquered flask. Both were unremarkable to the eye plane in their perfection, aged in their simplicity. But within that cup, the plum wine waited, cooled to the exact degree where sweetness held. Its form without becoming bold. The emperor did not drink immediately. He sat beside the table, sleeves pooled at his wrists, eyes watching the garden as twilight pressed gently into its corners. The shadows grew longer, not darker, but quieter. The stillness of the air was touched by faint notes of plum blossom and sandalwood, as if the evening itself was exhaling. When he finally lifted the cup, the ceramic felt smooth, like river-polished stone. He held it between his fingers, allowing its coolness to speak first. Then he brought it to his lips, not to drink, but to breathe it in. The scent of fermented fruit, aged wood, and memory rose slowly, unfurling like a silken banner. The first sip was small, barely more than a taste, but it lingered. It touched his tongue like a whisper round and deep, with a soft acidity that reminded him of nights long past. He closed his eyes as he swallowed, not from fatigue, but to let the warmth settle where words could not go. The wine was not meant to intoxicate. It was never served in celebration or excess. It was quiet wine, contemplative, offered at the edge of day. In its taste was something more than fruit, something like patience, or the sensation of a breeze that almost carries a voice. It encouraged silence. It nurtured slowness. It paired best with dusk. He drank again, a little more this time. The liquid rolled across his tongue, rich but restrained. Outside, the sky began its slow shift from amethyst to shadow. A bird sang, once and then stopped, as if it too had tasted something it wanted to remember. The emperor remained still. The table bore no food. None was needed. The wine itself was sustenance, not for the body, but for the spaces in between, for the quiet, gaps between decisions, for the places memory softened into emotion. The cup was raised again and again set down, each time more gently, until the sound of porcelain on wood disappeared into habit. Twilight deepened. The corners of the room turned indigo. The emperor's eyes adjusted slowly, not fighting the darkness, but accepting it, as one accepts the turning of seasons or the slow settling of silt in water. He reached for the flask once more and poured another measure. The liquid caught what remained of the light translucent amber, almost glowing. Each sip seemed to lengthen time, as if hours could be folded into the space between breaths. He felt the warmth move through him, spreading not outward, but inward, toward the places where thought had long since turned to feeling, and feeling to understanding. There was no tension in him, no weight, only wine and twilight and breath. He did not think of matters of rule, not tonight. He did not summon names or titles, nor trace the lineage of dynasties in his thoughts. No maps unfolded in his mind. No provinces arranged themselves into patterns of power. The empire, vast and breathing, could wait. It had waited before, in moments like this, quiet, suspended, untouched by decree. And the stars, those ancient companions, would continue their turning whether or not he lifted his gaze to meet them. For now, he was simply a man seated by the open lattice of his chamber, with a single cup of plum wine held gently between his palms and the silence to receive it. That silence was not empty. It was full of air warmed by the last traces of sunlight, full of stillness that stretched like silk across the polished floor, full of the kind of peace that arrived only when nothing was required. From somewhere deep within the palace walls, a bell sounded. Its tone was low, deep, and round like a drop of water falling into a still pool. It rolled through the twilight with grace, not interrupting the moment, but entering it as a guest. The emperor lowered his cup and listened. The sound did not call him. It simply joined him. And then it faded, not into silence, but into a deeper quiet one that held memory like a fragrance, just barely lingering in the air. Beside him, the flask remained on the low table, half empty now. But it felt abundant, generous. Its presence was comforting, like a candle still glowing in a dim room. A promise that the moment had not yet ended, that the ritual could continue just a little longer, like twilight refusing to fold completely. Into night dot, as the final streaks of light withdrew from the window frame, the emperor leaned back slightly. The warmth of the wine settled deep into his chest. Outside, a breeze rose cool, clean, touched by leaves and dusk. It entered the room and brushed against his skin. He did not shiver. The coolness outside and the warmth within balanced each other perfectly, like two wings rising in slow, synchronized motion. He let his eyes close not to sleep, but to feel. Behind his eyelids, the taste of plum lingered. The color of the sky lingered. The hush of the evening became a part of him. Later, the cup would be rinsed, the flask sealed, the window shuttered, but not yet. For now, he remained in the pause, not ruling, not remembering, only being. And the plum wine, gentle and deep, had become the night's first dream. The pathway to the golden Hammam curved inward like the thought of sleep. Stone walls, veined with threads of white and amber, glowed with the memory of sun even as night descended. Here, within this secluded wing of the palace, voices never rose above whispers, and water moved with the gentleness of silk folding in upon itself. The emperor entered barefoot, each step pressing quietly into the warm mosaic tiles beneath him. There were no attendants now, no procession, no bronze doors flung open with ceremony, only the soft echo of his presence and the hush of water waiting. The air was thick with heat, perfumed with orange blossom and crushed coriander. Time, no. Longer past. It steeped, like tea, in the stillness dot inside. The room breathed. Lanterns hung in alcoves carved with crescent shapes, casting golden reflections on the marble. Steam rose in delicate tendrils. The pools shimmered faintly in the low light, their surfaces as still as polished mirrors. The Hammam did not receive noise. It absorbed it. All sound here became quiet thought, and every breath became a small prayer. He disrobed without hurry. The robe fell in a soft rustle, folding itself on the bench like a petal released from bloom. He stepped into the warmth with the care of someone entering memory. The water met him with open arms, neither cool nor hot, only perfect. It closed around his body, cradling him without effort, without weight. There was no ritual spoken, but his body moved as if remembering. He poured water over his shoulders, his arms, the back of his neck. Each motion slow, deliberate, like calligraphy traced in steam. A bronze bowl floated near him, filled with soft linen and an herbal paste that smelled of cedar and crushed lotus seed. He pressed it gently to his chest, then across his collarbone, his pulse points, his skin made smooth by heat and silence. No mirrors in this place. Nothing reflective except the surface of the water itself. And yet, in this sanctuary, he saw himself more clearly than in any polished glass. Not as emperor, not as ruler, but simply as a body that breathed, a body that had endured, a body that now rested high above. Water trickled gently down carved stone, tracing veins like threads of music. The sound was not a song, but a rhythm of peace. It pulsed softly, like a heartbeat outside the body. And the emperor listened, not with ears, but with skin, with presence. He moved to the shallow end of the chamber, where a stone bench lay submerged just below the surface. He sat, reclining slightly, arms open along the marble edge, eyes half closed. Light from a single lantern reflected in slow patterns across the ceiling, turning the golden dome above into a sky of shifting silk. It did not spin. It drifted. A constellation of shadows woven from steam and time. In this golden Hammam, nothing was required. Nothing was rushed. Even the water seemed to pause before touching him. Every gesture, every ripple, every breath held the weight of stillness. Here, the emperor was neither guest nor host. He belonged to the silence as much as the stone did, as much as the air and heat and scent belonged to one another. Eventually, he lay fully back, his ears dipping just beneath the surface. The sound of the world shifted instantly everything, becoming soft, distant, as if the palace itself were dreaming. Even his heartbeat seemed muffled, translated into the language of water and hush. His eyes closed, but not in sleep. It was something deeper, quieter, a yielding, a return. The weight he carried elsewhere did not follow him here. In this pool, no wars were remembered, no sons were mourned, no ambitions measured. There was only the breath, the slow inhale, the slower exhale, the scent of steam, the warm kiss of moisture across closed lids. And time, if it moved at all, moved like water without current. He did not know how long he stayed. The world outside might have folded entirely into night. The stars might have gathered above the courtyard, whispering of destinies yet unwritten. But within these marble walls, the emperor remained untouched by such matters. He had become the silence he entered. He had become the still water. Eventually, without intention or command, he rose. The water, once wrapped around him like a second skin, slipped away with reluctance, leaving behind a scattering of droplets that clung to his body like pearls shimmering, quiet, alive. He reached for a robe fresh, thick, and pale as morning fog, and folded it over himself with reverence, not for the garment, but for the moment it completed. His bare feet pressed again into the mosaic path, the stones warm from the day, now cooling under the breath of the coming night. The Hammam, golden and still behind him, offered no sound of farewell. It needed none. It breathed on without him, its walls steeped in centuries of silence and steam, its waters holding memory without clinging. He passed beneath the final archway, and there, as though the world had been waiting, a breeze stirred, cooler than before. Touched by the scent of night jasmine and soil still warm from the sun, it wrapped gently around him. He stopped. And in that pause, unhurried, undirected something shimmered. Not understanding, not epiphany, Something smaller than either. Flicker of knowing. A whisper of presence. The awareness that in surrendering to stillness, he had drawn close to something sacred. Not by reaching or grasping, but by becoming part of it. That to pause was not to falter. That softness, unbroken and sustained, was a language of its own, a form of quiet rule. He breathed once more, deeply, not as a ruler, nor as a figure of legend, but simply as a man, stepping into the hush of night with no need to disturb it. Behind him, the Hammam glowed softly, golden, and unchanging. The waters did not ripple, and the emperor, lighter than before, disappeared into the stillness without leaving a trace. The emperor visits a hidden incense hall where dreams are read through drifting smoke. This part unfolds slowly, describing the textures of saffron-dyed cushions, delicate braziers, and the scent-thickened air. A sense of sacred stillness permeates the chamber, with no conversation, only the silence of prophecy, reflection, and dreamed out the path to the oracle hall was not marked on any map. It curved through cloistered courtyards, slipped between shadowed walls, and dipped beneath archways, thick with flowering vines that only opened after nightfall. The emperor walked this way alone, each footstep quiet, the hem of his robe brushing old stone like whispered reverence. The moon hung high but veiled, and the stars blinked softly behind a layer of warm haze. The scent of saffron floated faintly. Ahead, carried on a draught that felt both ancient and new. When he reached the hall, he paused. There were no guards, no attendants, only a carved wooden door, lacquered in black, etched with a gentle swirl of clouds and flame. He touched it, lightly. It opened soundlessly, revealing a room that seemed to breathe. Inside, the air was thick with incensed saffron, myrrh, cedarwood. Smoke curled through the rafters and lingered in slow waves above the floor. The light came not from lamps, but from bowls of coals that glowed quietly in low braziers, their surfaces dotted with red embers like stars lost in dreaming. Cushions dyed in deep ochre, and plums circled the space, arranged in layers as if prepared not for comfort but for surrender. He moved inward, guided not by sight but by scent. The room welcomed him, its warmth immediate, wrapping around his limbs like steam. Every surface seemed soft, velvet, silk, suede, aged by touch. And yet, beneath it all, there was a stillness firm enough to hold a kingdom. He sat at the room's center, upon a cushion that sank slightly beneath his weight. He did not call for the oracle. There was no need. The smoke had already begun to change. From a small brazier beside him, a thin line of saffron incense rose in coils. It bent and turned, looped and twisted, forming patterns that drifted toward the open dome above. There were no windows, only this opening to the sky, a perfect circle where smoke and starlight met in silence. He watched. There was no interpretation offered, no scroll or voice to guide him, only the movement of scented vapor, shifting in rhythms older than language. It was said the smoke revealed what one already knew, but dared not name, that the oracle was not a person, but the part of the self. Awakened when the world grew still, the emperor's breath slowed, and with it, the chamber seemed to exhale. The smoke no longer drifted randomly. It moved with intention, as if stirred by memory rather than air. And as the lines of incense curled through the stillness, images began to surface not as visions in the way of dreams, but as impressions, drawn from a place beneath thought. A hand, reaching once hesitant, unfinished. A door closing, soundless but final. A garden in early spring, its mossy paths untouched by footsteps for years, as though waiting for someone who had forgotten how to return. The curve of a woman's spine, seen only once through a parted screen, who never spoke in his presence. Yet somehow, Her silence had settled in him more deeply than any poem he had ever read. The scent of rain falling on lacquered wood. The touch of a child's forehead pressed against his palm, brief, burning, unforgettable. None of it foretold the future. None promised clarity or order. These were not omens. They were truth's small, quiet ones, carried in the folds of time. Fragments that had never left him, but had waited, suspended, for him to be still enough to notice. He did not come here to be told. He came to remember the saffron smoke thickened around him. It did not blind, but enveloped. Within its amber swirls, something began to take shape, vague at first, then tenderly human. Not a figure, not quite. A suggestion of form, a bend, a shoulder, the rise of breath. It pulsed once, a single inhalation held too long, and then collapsed back into mist. But its meaning lingered. A curve, a wave, a breath once held, now released. The Emperor inhaled, and let it go. Time moved strangely here, or perhaps it ceased entirely. Minutes had no urgency. Hours had no edge. It felt as though the room folded inward, making space for something older than sequence. Somewhere in the dim, perfumed stillness, a bell sounded, barely audible, no louder than a sigh through silk. The Emperor did not stir. He remained seated, eyes half closed, spine straight, yet soft, his fingers resting lightly on his knees. The warmth of the brazier licked gently at his hands, grounding him. Even as everything around him lifted beyond the chamber, the empire continued. Names would be summoned. Scrolls would be sealed with vermilion and iron. Officials would wait for his decision. Generals would study maps under candlelight. But none of that belonged here. Not in this sacred room. In here, the ink was breath, the parchment, silence. And truth, if it existed at all, was not bound by form or certainty, but moved like vapor. Honest, elusive, real. Eventually, the coals dimmed. The saffron stick burned to ash. The smoke dissolved upward and vanished into the open dome. But the scent remained rich, golden, persistent. It clung not to fabric, but to thought. And in the hidden places of the room, something else lingered too. A trace of him, a shape of stillness, a presence unnamed. He rose slowly. The cushion beneath him did not resist. The silence welcomed his parting as gently as it had accepted. His arrival. There was no curtain to draw, no figure to bow. The Emperor stepped softly across the threshold, into the cooled night air. Above him, the moon had shifted. The stars had rearranged. He had not been gone long, and yet the world had changed, as it always does. Behind him, the oracle hall resumed its breathing constant, weightless, untouched by history. He walked forward, holding nothing. Yet he was full of saffron and smoke, full of impressions not spoken, but felt, full of the night's offerings, delicate, uncertain, and complete. And the scent of saffron still clung to his sleeves, like memory, like prophecy, like sleep drifting in. The moon had reached its zenith over the palace gardens, illuminating paths woven between moss-draped hollies and ancient mulberry trees. At this hour, the garden breathed differently. Its long shadows softened, its fragrances deepened into something subtle, sacred. The air was warm, but not oppressive, carrying the faint perfume of rice blossoms and dew-soaked earth. There was no breeze now, only a stillness so profound that the leaves did not stir, and the surface of the reflecting pool lay undisturbed, like glass. The Emperor moved slowly through the courtyard, barefoot on stone cooled by night. His robe whispered at his ankles, trailing lightly behind him. He paused at the edge of the pool where silver moonlight rippled across the black water. Above him, countless stars blinked through branches, but here in the garden they felt closer, pregnant with unspoken promise, each a seed of light waiting to fall. Two women walked silently beside him. Not concubines summoned for business. Not figures of ceremony or display. They were his companions in a nocturne of quiet. Unfolding. Each held her hands gently against the swell of her belly, skin warm beneath silk encasing hidden life. They had followed him without fanfare, arriving beside the pool not as attendants, but as echoes of something ancient and persistent. The emperor did not speak. He did not gesture or offer instruction. Instead, he let the soft radiance of stars meet the glow of growing life, and something in the space between them, between his breath and hers, throbbed with possibility. They paused together, forming a triangle of quiet awareness, as if the garden itself honored them. He bent to the pool's edge and dropped a single ring into the water, an heirloom carved with ancestral script. The ring sank with a faint splash. That seemed louder in the absence of sound. As it disappeared, the surface flattened instantly. Moonlight fractured into concentric patterns, small stars of reflection that glowed before fading back to stillness. He did not retrieve it. It remained unseen, an offering to silence and lineage alike dot above the pool. Petals drifted slow and late-white as moonlight, pink as memory. They moved not outward, but inward, floating toward the pool's center, collecting at an unseen current. He watched as two blossoms curved together, their shapes melding into a subtle form, a symbol of unity without ceremony or design. The women watched too, faces bearing nothing but understanding God. No words were spoken. The night did not demand speech. It offered communion in absence. One of the women knelt beside him, as reverent in posture as he was in presence. She leaned forward slightly, and the emperor placed a single hand atop hers. Their combined warmth pulsed not with force, but with quiet life. The other woman leaned forward also, angled toward the ring's ripple, toward the petal's drift. Their breathing synchronized, two breaths spiraling into one gentle rhythm. The pool held everything in its silence. The trees leaned inward. The sky pressed low. Even the stones seemed to acknowledge the gravity of that moment, not weight, but intention. Occasions like this were not calendar events. They were quiet decisions of the body and blood, of fate woven slowly over generations dot above them. A lone orchid unfurled on its branch. Not audacious, not fragrant, just pale and patient, releasing itself tonight. The emperor looked up and saw the petals stark against the dark, lit only by starlight. He thought of the women's future children heirs, not of conquest, but of breath and being. He thought of how small life begins, in concealment, in ripple, in memory. Time dripped slowly in the garden. Minutes stretched like the curve of a petal caught in its fall. The emperor shifted from kneeling to standing, careful, patient. The women rose too, their silk rustling like a soft promise. He turned and offered no escort, no farewell. Instead, he continued along a narrow path through the garden's heart, through clusters of black bamboo and low lantern stands carved with lotus petals. The pathway curved upward to a small pavilion where incense smoke hung in coils beneath its eaves. Here, he stopped again. The women remained at a respectful distance, their forms mirrored in the polished dark wood. The pavilion was empty, but its light glowed faintly, an amber lamp tucked in a corner, casting lattice shadows that wavered like breathing. A small bird called somewhere far off, once, then faintly again. It did not break the stillness. It became part of it. The emperor reached out to touch one bamboo post, fingers feeling the ridges worn by countless hands. His palm rested there, grounding him in presence. He inhaled slowly, letting the garden's night perfume fill his lungs of jasmine, of damp stone, of unborn fruit. The two women stood quietly behind him, forming silent pillars of continuity. The emperor closed his eyes, briefly not in sleep. but in grace. Somewhere in the sky the moon shifted slightly, and without noticing, his shoulders relaxed. The weight of expectation, of empire, of legacy, not extinguished, but held softly, as though placed on water. They walked on. Through shadows that felt soft enough to rest upon. Through paths lit only by starlight and lantern flame. The garden opened and closed around them, as petals open and fall, as lineage is both seed and soil, not abrupt, not impatient. Just evolving dot, when at last they reached the threshold of the inner gate, the emperor paused once more. He did not look back. He did not speak. He simply stepped forward. The women followed, barefoot now, their steps echoing in slow time, like drops falling into a still basin. Behind them, the garden of conceived stars remained moonlit, petaled, pulsing, with unborn lives. It did not fade. It held fast in stillness, offering peace not by ruling over, but by quietly enduring. They entered the palace. The doors closed lightly behind them, absorbing sound as always. Inside, the hush awaited, soft as silk, full as memory. And in that silence, lineage took root not with ceremony, but with breath. At the fall of dusk, when moonlight softened the palace in silver shade, and torches had just begun to awaken their glow, the ritual would begin. A single male goat small, silent, white as pale mist, was brought into the inner court. Its fleece gleamed faintly in lantern light. No fanfare preceded its steps. It was not led by men bearing drums or heralds with trumpets. Instead, a lone eunuch, his face calm and gait measured, guided the goat through shadowed corridors and beneath red lanterns. The air quivered with anticipation, yet remained hushed. The goat walked slowly, not trained, not hurried. Its hooves touched mosaic as softly as petals fall. It passed beneath carved wooden screens. Its breath steamed slightly in the night air. It paused at each door, each carved arch deep with floral vines and lacquered in jade or black. The eunuch did not nudge it. He only waited respectfully, unremarkably. 5,000 chambers lined the corridors. So many silent doors, each housing someone who knew tomorrow, the palace would whisper that the goat had paused here, or dipped here, or turned near this threshold. But tonight, there was nothing but slow movement and gentle breaths. At each door, the goat sniffed. Sometimes it rested a hoof at the threshold. Sometimes it passed on, never hesitating, never hurrying. Within each room, a single candle might flicker. The silk drapes would stir faintly with its presence. The maidens inside wound their breaths tighter as the goat passed. They did not speak. They did not move. In stillness, they listened for its footfall, for its breath, for the faintest pause. 2 rooms were special this night, rooms held by maidens who carried life within them. They did not touch them differently. The ritual did not alter for motherhood. They knelt quietly at their screens, each wearing silk saturated with lotus and amber scents. Their stillness was deeper, like water beneath ice. They held life within. Then not as consequence, but as continuity. The goat continued. Eventually, after many chambers, it paused before one door. It did not serve force or threat. It simply stopped. Head bowed slightly, breath steady. Its eyes glowed faintly in the lamplight. The eunuch marked the chamber quietly in a folded scroll, writing date and hour with perfect calm. Then he stepped away. Inside, the chosen maiden's stillness remained like a note held too softly to measure. She did not stand. She did not wait outside. She stayed where she was, listening. And soon the emperor would come, not because of hunger, not because of command, but because ritual had called him. He would enter that room with the same breath-laced purpose he brought to every quiet space, a presence wrapped in scent, silk and memory, The corridor, the one the goat departed, stayed silent, as though it had swallowed the ritual into its bones. Torches flickered. Shadows sharpened. No song played. No applause. Only the warmth left by the goat's passage. Still traceable in the air dot sometimes, the goat lingered for a moment more before stepping away. But tonight, it did not. The selection complete, it walked to a darkened corner and waited. The eunuch reappeared and guided it back through the halls. Each step deliberate, each breath soft. Again, no music, no words. The only sound was hoof on stone, echoing faintly in the hush dot back in the private chamber. The goat would be greeted with delicate offerings of barley straw and water scented with chrysanthemum. It would be thanked in silence for its part. The eunuch would wait. The air would tighten with expectation. A low lamp would glow in readiness. Soon, beyond the screen, the emperor would move toward the chosen room. Outside, in the moonlit garden, petals drifted slowly onto paths. The night. Sky leaned over the palace with all its silver eyes. No wind stirred the leaves. No insect whispered except one distant cricket, paused as if listening to its own heart. Inside the palace, a selected chamber held its breath again. A door opened softly. The emperor entered. He did not hurry. He did not announce himself. In the hush, he moved like breath, slipping through dusk, gentle, calm, inexorable. The goat remained outside, waiting. Its service complete. Its presence honored. It would later be released into the gardens, where it would slip through the night grass into the hush of the outer walls. And then the palace would sigh again, returning to silence dot in the days that followed. Poets would compose verses about the night's gentle ritual. Scholars, always in pursuit of meaning, would debate the symbolism of the goat's steps, the stillness of silk-draped chambers. Courtiers, too finely attuned to power subtleties, would whisper the name of the chosen room, repeating it like a charm or omen, but none of that belonged to the moment itself. That night there was no performance, no proclamation, no ambition, only the soft hush of hooves against stone, and a single breath held behind a screen of silk. Only the emperor, entering not as sovereign, but as presence. As witness dot the palace stretched in every direction, a vast architecture of rule and memory. Yet in that one chamber, beneath the warm flicker of candlelight, everything narrowed to this. Breath meeting breath, silence wrapping around closeness. Like a second skin, there was no crown in that room, no inked decree. There was only ritual preserved not by command, but by repetition, by reverence, by softness. The corridor the goat had passed through would remember the steps. The chamber, the hush dot and above, the night sky turned as it always had patient. Watching, untouched dot when morning came, someone would quietly note the event in a narrow scroll. The eunuchs would store it in a drawer lined with velvet and ink. A guard might murmur what he saw. But all that would come later dot at midnight, the world slept, and the palace dreamed. And in that dream was a single, quiet act, the pause before. Presence, the choosing before touch, the ancient weight of silence, carrying power no crown could hold. And it would linger. Like perfume, like breath, like a secret the stars had known all along. In a distant corner of the palace, away from silk-draped chambers and open courtyards, there existed a narrow chamber known to very few. It held no throne, no seat of judgment, no heraldic banners. It was the place where quiet was given form, where the emperor's most private moments were noted not in speech, but in ink slowed by ritual dot. When the chosen door closed behind the emperor, a single eunuch waited nearby. He carried a slender leather scroll, folded like a poem, yet unnamed. His robes were plain and unadorned, pale enough not to cast shadow, yet soft in texture, like a whisper. His breath was steady, Measured by years of service, by long nights learning to see without being seen, his task was sacred in its stillness. Not a duty, not a chore, but a form of presence so faintly felt. You might almost doubt it existed. Yet in each careful stroke of his brush, lineage and legacy took shape. He did not watch for ambition, nor for ceremony. He watched for breath, for alignment, for the silent ritual that connected body, memory, and empire. The chamber was dim. A single lamp burned low, its flame steady. The light lay across a narrow table of lacquered wood, polished by centuries. On the table lay the scroll, the brush, and a small ink cup filled with black liquid true ink made from soot and glue, and a small bowl of cool water for rinsing the brush between notations. He crept forward with no haste, only intention. Placing the scroll before him, he brushed a drop of ink across the grain of the paper. The line ran smooth, not jagged. It could have stood for a date. It could have stood for a chamber number. But it stood for more. The echo of footsteps, the pause of breath, the sacred timing of something human meeting something ceremonial. Each evening followed the same pattern, not by rote, but by resonance. The eunuch dipped the brush again and recorded the hour. The emperor had passed through the corridor at midnight, or a whisper before. Tonight it was just after the lanterns had dimmed, when only the moonlight remained to guide the way. Next, the eunuch wrote the chamber chosen, but he did not write its name. He noted instead the scent on the air lotus oil, faint sandalwood, maybe rain on wood, so that even without a name, the record carried something one could sense. The record was not merely data. It was memory encoded. He paused, letting the glow of the lamp warm his fingers. It was said that some emperors demanded these lists to be public. Some took pride in choice, in order, but not this emperor. He received the scroll later, folded small, threaded with red string. He seldom looked at it. He didn't need to. His body remembered what the ink merely recorded. Tonight's entry was simple. Midnight, light flame, soft fragrance. Nothing more. Enough to say, tonight again. Under ritual, presence held. Ritual of goat led, soul met. No triumph. No demand. The eunuch did not sign his name. He left only the brush's mark. The record was meant to be as invisible as presence, yet as enduring as stone. He could close the scroll and place it among the others. But there would be no ceremony, no reading aloud. The archive was sealed in a velvet cabinet where scrolls lay like petals pressed between leaves. The eunuch stood. He did not move quickly. He did not bow. He simply returned the brush to its rest. The lamp burned softly. The chamber held. Outside, the palace slept with corridors empty and lanterns darkened. No servant stirred. The night was thicker now. Sound had folded in on itself. The eunuch's task had ended not with fanfare, but with stillness. He exited into hush, closing the narrow door behind him without letting sound escape. In the corridor, beneath the moonlit screens, the scent of the ritual remained, an exhalation, like a held breath released softly. He walked back through long halls, past doors that had known the emperor's presence only moments before. He did not feel the heat of cloth or silk. He felt only the quiet left in the air. He did not speak. He did not think. He merely carried the scroll, now marked, now close. To memory, back to the archive, at dawn. A court historian might enter that archive to catalog names and dates. But tonight, before the sun rose, the scroll existed only as itself, a record of pause, of selection, of subtle power restrained by ritual. The act of recording was not a duty, but a ritual quiet, deliberate, and sacred. It did not belong to the machinery of rule, nor to the spectacle of empire. It belonged to something deeper, the rhythm of continuity. In the hush between brush and parchment, The eunuch bore witness, not to power declared, but to presence offered. He was not merely a servant. He did not kneel before thrones or chase favor through halls. His authority was silence, his loyalty, breath. Each stroke of ink held memory. The faint scent of chosen oil, the hush of a corridor, the moment before the door was drawn shut. He transcribed what could not be spoken, the feeling of the emperor's quiet entry, the heat of ritual passed between living bodies. When the scroll was folded and tied with red thread, he carried it carefully to the waiting cabinet. Among its siblings it would rest, unread but known. He bowed not to a ruler, but to the sacred act of remembering. There was no crown on his head, no lineage behind his name. Yet he held within him the memory of firelight, of footfall, of choice made in silence. He turned and departed, his steps swallowed by the deeper quiet of the palace. Behind him, the cabinet remained, its dark wood holding time like water in a vessel, and the scrolls inside, untouched and unspoken, endured as witnesses to all that had passed, without announcement. As the last lanterns dimmed and the corridors fell into hush, the eunuch, too, faded into the stillness, his task complete, his presence light as breath. And yet, like the empire itself, what he recorded would endure quietly, invisibly, but without end. The night had deepened beyond all expectation, and in one private chamber bathed in amber lamplight, the emperor rested. Not proclaimed, not displayed. Here, beneath woven covers of crimson silk embroidered with gold phoenix feathers, he lay, beside a maiden whose belly swelled with lineage yet unborn. The room was quiet, but not empty. It held warmth, the warmth of living flesh, of life stretching toward life, of breath meeting breath beneath layers of silk and candle haze. The bed itself curved gently under them, as if shaped over years of comfort. The silk glowed softly, not bright, but warm with undisturbed color. Its folds cradled their forms. The embroidery, once sharp in its threads, had softened. A phoenix in repose, wings folded, eyes closed. It mirrored the room's own hush. History settled, waiting yet complete. The emperor lay on his side, facing the maiden. Between them a small space, filled with stillness, not distance, but reverence. He did not speak. She did not stir. Yet they knew the chamber held more than two bodies. It held possibility future heirs, memory of ancestors, promise unspoken. A single candle flickered in a bronze stand near the hearth. Its flame curved softly, casting shadows that stretched over lacquered screens, painted with plum blossoms. A light trembled in time with their breathing. Each exhale shifted the air, scented by the candle wax, by faint lotus from earlier hours, by the coolness seeped in through the shutters. The emperor reached out not to claim, but to be. His hand found the gentle curve of her belly, tracing its shape as if reading quiet truths beneath silk. The maiden did not move. Her breath deepened, steady, and her hand met his in silence, a touch not of need, but of trust. Their fingers rested together, light as thread. Around them, the room held still. Time softened. No summons called, no future pressed. Only breath shared in even rhythm, cradle to cradle. A breeze slipped past the shutter, brushing his skin with a whisper of coolness. He remained, present, aware. The warmth was not his to own, but to witness. And beneath their hands, life continued silent, unseen, infinite. Outside, in distant courtyard gardens, cicadas sang their slow evening chorus. The voices were faint beneath stone arches and cedar eaves, but within this chamber they were felt deeper, like a pulse beneath skin. Their song matched the quiet rhythm between father and child, between breath and breath, between dream and memory. The maiden shifted slightly, not enough to disturb the silk or unveil her form. Just enough that heat pooled beneath him. A small inhale, a small exhale. The rhythm remained unchanged. The Emperor tilted his head, aware of the movement's softness, of life's persistence in stilled form. A memory passed through him. When he was still young, his own mother cradled him under a silk canopy. He remembered her breath, shallow but steady, her fingers worn with age, pressing against his infant back. That memory was not loud. It came as a whisper of knowing. It touched him now, here, in this cradle of red silk. He closed his eyes, not in sleep, but in gratitude. Gratitude for stillness. Gratitude for continuity unspoken. Gratitude for the Yao. Quiet strength that exists not in decree or command, but in the simple act of being present. The candle cracked faintly, a sound so soft it might have been imagined. Its flame swayed, drawing a slow pattern across the painted ceiling. A plum blossom rotated into view inside the shadow, a pale petal lifted by unseen air. The room breathed with it. The Emperor shifted again, sliding his palm to cradle the life within her. His fingers traced a curve, no imprint, no pressure, just acknowledgement, like a vow whispered to soft silk. She remained motionless. Their breaths aligned. He did not speak. She did not ask. The chamber held the silence between them, luminous and full. Outside, the moon dipped slightly. The veranda beyond the windows rippled in silver. But inside, the red silk absorbed the dimming light like memory softened by time. Patterns in the embroidery turned deeper, richer. The phoenix uncurled one wing as though waking from a sleep older than the wood beneath that bed. Night insects paused as if sensing holiness. The air thickened with scent-old sandalwood, faint lotus, warm cedar, amber from incense long past. Even the stones beneath the bed seemed to hum quiet memory of footsteps, of childhood, of everyday lineages. Emperor's breath stilled, not gone, just deeper, more essential. The maidens who slept elsewhere in the palace would not stir. Guards in other corridors leaned away from torches. The entire palace exhaled into one breath. The space between them held something sacred, a seed, a promise. A quiet repetition of what had come before. Quiet repetition of what might come again. Time did not end within the chamber. It merely softened, folding inward like silk wrapped with care, stitched by hands that understood the fragility of inheritance. In that gentle fold of quiet, there rested something greater than memory, a hush that carried heirloom, ritual, and the promise of return. The Emperor, sensing the shift in the night's breath, eased his hand from where it had rested, on the soft rise of her belly where lineage stirred in silence, not withdrawn, but lowered gently, his fingers brushing the embroidered silk leaf beneath him like a reverent gesture offered to time itself. Beside him, the maiden remained still not asleep, perhaps, but deeply within herself, floating on the same tide of warmth and unspoken knowledge that held them both suspended beneath the silk canopy. He exhaled through his nose, slowly and fully, drawing in the sense that defined this moment, the richness of red silk warmed by skin, the faint sweetness of perfumed oil, the almost imperceptible trace of breath turned lullaby. Outside, palace drifted into deeper sleep. Torches dimmed, echoes vanished, and long halls quieted like forgotten scrolls. But within the candlelit room, layered in shadow and memory, all that mattered had already arrived. The Emperor neared sleep, not overtaken, but welcomed like a child into silence. Beside him, the maiden lay still, pretending, perhaps, or simply believing. No crown was needed, only warmth shared, breath aligned, and stillness profound. In that hush, they were held by silk, by presence, by dreams red as dusk. Moonlight spilled softly into the courtyard, where the ancestral waters lay in ornamental pool carved of pale stone. lay deep within a tucked-away corner of the palace grounds. A single stone bridge arched gently above it, and over its quiet surface floated petals in slow drift. These were not just petals, but offerings pale blossoms from old trees that had blossomed seasons ago, cast here in silence by hands meant to heal. Their colors ranged from soft ivory to pale rose, weightless on the glass water. The surface held them like memory. The emperor stepped barefoot onto the bridge, his robe smooth behind him. He paused at midpoint, with a lantern above cast, a halo on the still water below. His reflection trembled softly beneath him, long hair dark as midnight, robes faintly stained by incense, eyes dimmed by centuries of inheritance. He did not reach to touch the water. He only gazed dot around the pool. Bamboo stalks leaned inward, their rustle muted and respectful. The quiet was thick. Even the night air felt damp with remembrance. The petals drifted in circles, tangential yet inevitable, forming whirlpools of scent and stillness. Every ring of petals traced a pattern beneath the surface echoes of older decisions, gentler promises, bloodlines whispered and carried. The emperor inhaled the faint scent of lotus that lingered on the breeze. Water lily floated near the edges, their petals half dipped. He recognized them, flowers that symbolized birth, purity, transformation. He closed his eyes. In the hush of ancestral presence, he felt something like vertical time history rising up from the water to meet him. He stepped from the bridge and knelt at the water's edge, silk pooling beneath him, sleeves drawn back to reveal forearms, pale in lantern light. He dipped a single fingertip into the water, careful not to disturb more than one petal's drift. The ripple traveled outward. A single wave stretched across petals, pushing them to new positions. It was a small disturbance, but meaningful. He did not linger. He did not alter more. He sat still and watched Dot in that moment. He imagined each petal as a life born of this palace, each a child, an heir, a silent dream made flesh. Some lives had bloomed. Others had withered early. Some petals were still fragrant. Others had turned papery and broken. He let that truth rest beside him. Nearby, a low bench carved from ancient marble cradled a small bowl of water, a ceremonial basin meant for offerings. A single lotus blossom lay on it, fresh and white, untouched. He reached for it and lifted it carefully. He leaned forward, finger trailing across the petals, and whispered nothing. He placed the blossom into the deeper water. It floated briskly at first, flickering across the surface. Then it slowed and settled among the older petals, sinking just enough to join them in still communion. The lantern above flickered once. The reflection of flame pooled in the water like gold coin. Shadows of petals and flame danced together, nurturing the hushed Dot. He inhaled again. The scent of lotus, the dank earth edge of old stones, the faint memory of incense burned long ago, all combined into something deeper than scent. It felt ancestral. There was no ritual music, no attendant's presence, no oversight, only solitude and lineage. This pool was not for spectacle. It was for remembering. He rose, brushed silk over legs, and stood again upon the stone bridge. His gaze traveled across the drifting petals toward the darkness beyond, the gardens, the walls, the sky. He saw not emptiness, but possibility. Not endings, but echoes of continuity. Dot above him, the moon shifted slightly. A petal caught moonlight and glowed. It moved on water as if alive. He allowed the quiet to settle into his bones. The pool did not demand answers. It held questions without pressing for response. Where does lineage begin? Where does it end? What is meant to pass, and what must be held in stillness? He stepped back from the edge, returning to the marble path. Each footfall made no sound listened, for rather than heard. He passed beneath archways open to night, each carved screen topped with a lattice of vines and blossoms. Petals occasionally drifted onto his robes. As though the pool followed him, a gentle breeze stirred again, and the petals shifted in tandem, not enough to disturb, only enough to remind. He reached into the basin again, pulling another fresh white blossom from water and holding it loosely. He lifted it toward the reflection of the bridge lantern. He watched the flame glint through the petals as though lighting them from within. Then he let it fall. A small splash merged into silent motion. Another petal fell slowly into the drifting. See, another circle began. The emperor exhaled. He did not seek resolution. There was no firm finish. Only the slow dissolution of once fragrant things into water, into lineage, into memory. Nearby, old stone steps wound upward toward the palace. He ascended them slowly, his silhouette a dark arch beneath flickering lanterns. The petals from below looked like floating stars arranged in lines beyond his path. At the top of the steps, he paused, hand resting lightly on a carved railing, gaze drifting back toward the still pool below. The lotus petals remained, slow in their dance across the water, and the lantern's trembling reflection flickered softly among them. In their silent motion, he saw lineage not in names or decrees, but in the subtle folds of breath and blood, memory and presence. Turning away, he re-entered the palace. The corridors were dark and hushed, the air touched with the cool scent of jasmine and old stone. No herald marked his return. No light waited, only silence. Yet something within him had changed, an ease settling in his chest, as though something, long submerged, had been quietly acknowledged. The petals would remain on the ancestral waters, floating beneath moonlight. Even when morning came and the courtyard stirred, even if the petals vanished, what they carried would linger. Memory did not need to be seen to endure. Later, in his chamber, silk would brush skin and sleep would come. But the scent of blossoms, the stillness of drifting petals, and the hush of sacred water would echo in his dreams, offering something not named but known. The night deepened with deliberate grace, like silk drawn slowly across the shoulders of the sky. Over the curved roofs of the palace, over lacquered eaves and moon-silvered tiles, a hush settled. The stars shimmered faintly above, but inside, the emperor's private chambers, all radiance came from a single steady source, a lone candle, burning low. Its flame was neither fierce nor failing. It glowed like memory itself, gentle, golden, and enduring. Around it, the shadows moved quietly across the silken bed coverings, over walls carved with dragons and plum branches, and across the form of the emperor, reclined beneath layers of crimson and gold-threaded silk. He did not stir. The silks enfolded him, not just in warmth, but in stillness, in presence, in something that had no name, but had always been felt by those who ruled long enough to realize the difference between power and peace. There was no crown here, no armor, only embroidered sheets that whispered of ritual, of history, of hands that had prepared this chamber each night with reverence. The phoenixes stitched into the fabric above him did not fly, but they breathed. So did he. His breath came slow and deep, as if answering an ancient rhythm. Beneath his chest, his heart kept time with the flicker of the candlelight. It was a slow music, played without instrument. Only breath, only being. The air in the room was fragrant sandalwood and faded lotus, the residue of incense that had burned through many such nights. Scents that did not declare themselves, but lingered, soft as secrets. They wove around him, entered through his nose and settled in his chest until his whole body seemed wrapped not just in fabric, but in memory. The memory of spring rains on stone, of ink drying on scrolls, of fingertips brushing petals afloat in water, of lineage passed not by decree, but by the hush between breaths. Outside, the palace did not sleep entirely, it listened. Distant footfalls. Padded over distant floors. A gate clicked closed. A bird shifted on a perch in the dark. The world, even at rest, moved. But here, in this room, time slowed until it no longer pointed forward. It turned inward, folding upon itself like a ribbon drawn into a knot, or like silk being gathered at day's end. He did not close his eyes out of weariness. He closed them because there was nowhere else to look, no scroll left unexamined. Number. Decision left unmade. Everything essential was already here. He let the weight of the day recede not with effort, but with surrender. A kind of holy ease overtook him, the same one that comes to travelers who have reached the end of a long, hard road and for once are not asked to move again. Beside him, though the maiden lay silent, her breath was present, delicate, rhythmic, and steady. Their bodies did not touch now, but something invisible linked them still. A warmth, a gravity, a knowing. Beneath layers of silk, her presence was not passive. It held a quiet, certain power like soil before spring, like water before rain. Together, they had created something, not just life, but a moment. A sanctuary made of skin and time and silk. He drifted, and in drifting, he carried many things. The soft memory of petals drifting over ancestral water. The echo of a goat's hooves in the moonlight. The hush of scrolls being sealed by candlelight. The tremble of saffron smoke, forming near human shapes before dissolving into pure breath. He carried it all not as burden, but as offering. His body, finally, became a vessel not of command, but of continuity. The candle flickered once, twice, then settled. Its light thinned, grew taller, grew still. Shadows lengthened across his cheekbones, across the curve of the silk canopy. The curtains rustled faintly as the wind entered, soft, fragrant with jasmine, cool from the stone courtyards beyond. It touched his skin like a reminder, like a lullaby. Everything endures in stillness. Everything breathes. He did not move. Not from sleep, not from thought, but from something more complete than either. The wind stirred again. The silk around him whispered against itself. A faint perfume of red plum reached him, unplaceable, perhaps imagined, perhaps not. Somewhere, a bell chimed once, then fell. Silent. Time exhaled. Desire, no longer a command but a presence, settled beside him. It did not demand. It did not rise like fire. It lay coiled and quiet, like a cat in sun, like a truth that had no need of assertion. And in its softness, it promised him not power, but continuity. The emperor no longer ruler, not quite sleeper, let his final breath of waking curl out of him and dissolve into the dark. No crown adorned him, no decree echoed, but his stillness held a history too vast for words. The room, its tapestries, its silks, its cooled incense bowls breathed with him. Not from duty, but from memory held in stillness, the chamber breathed with him. Outside, the night wind wove softly through. Carved lattice. Inside, shadows deepened. The single candle, having watched in silence, flickered gently once, then again, and vanished into darkness, leaving behind only warmth and breath suspended in quiet. Now, breathe in. Let each inhale draw in the warmth of silk and memory. Let each exhale release the need to hold anything except this moment. Feel the soft weight of presence settle around you, just as it has around the emperor in his bed of satin and quiet. Imagine the last candle's glow fading gently at your side, its flame drifting from warm gold into calm shadow. There are no more decisions to make, no maps to trace, no rooms to be chosen. Right here, within your breath, lies lineage, promise, and stillness. You need nothing more. Allow your eyelids to rest softly, like petals settling on water. Let your breath become the tide, steady, unhurried, certain. The world outside may stir within hours, but for now, all that matters is the hush around you, the silk beneath you, the warmth against you. Sleep, dear traveler. Let candle, lotus, and lineage cradle you as they cradle him. Let dreams drift in like petals on ancestral waterlight, fragrant, unfolding. May your rest be deep, your breath unbroken. Good night, and see you in the next story by the fire.